We're going to have two parts of Revelation 3 here, huh?
Yep. This will be part 1 today. I might as well just telegraph what we're going to do. So in this episode, we're going to hit everything in Revelation 3 that's Old Testament pertinent that we haven't hit before. There is, in these letters, there's been overlap of content. This will be no different. But I'm going to skip the keys of David in Revelation 3:7, and that's what's going to be part 2, because we're going to take that verse and then loop back to Revelation 1:18, the keys of death and Hades, and devote a full episode to this keys stuff, this keys language. So hence we're going to have 2 parts, because there's just a lot going on with respect to the keys thing. That is really, I think, for this audience, especially in light of Unseen Realm, and I'll just tip it off a little bit, it's going to be directly connected to Christ's descent to the underworld. The 1 Peter 3 thing that it should be familiar for those who have read Unseen Realm, and the use of Enoch and the Watchers and all that kind of stuff. So that whole keys thing is going to be part of that. So that needs its own episode for sure. So this time, we're just going to hit the other stuff that we have not touched on before in Revelation 3. So part 1 is Old Testament and Revelation 3, everywhere else but that. So I'm going to start here by reading the first letter here, really the first 5 or 6 verses. You've got 3 churches here. This is the letter to the church in Sardis that the chapter starts out with. So let's just jump in here. I'm reading ESV. To the angel of the church in Sardis write the words of him who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know your works. You have the reputation of being alive, but you are dead. Wake up and strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have not found your works complete in the sight of my God. Remember then what you received and heard, keep it and repent. If you will not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come against you. Here's verse 4. Yet you have still a few names in Sardis, people who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. The one who conquers will be clothed thus in white garments, and I will never blot his name out of the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So that's the first 6 verses, and really aimed again at the church in Sardis. And what I want to focus on for our purposes, again, if you're just a listener jumping in here to the series, we're focused on the use of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. So we're not doing a verse-by-verse commentary on Revelation. We're not talking about end-time systems or anything like that. If some of that becomes relevant because of the use of the Old Testament, we'll hit that when we come to it. But our focus is on the impact of the Old Testament in this book. So in verses 4 and 5, we get a couple of phrases here that have, hooks back into the Old Testament. They will walk with me in white, and then this reference to white garments. And you also get a reference to white garments later in chapter 3 and verse 3:18, or chapter 3, verse 18. Now, white, if you actually, did a search, in the book of Revelation, white shows up a lot. It's a prominent color in the book of Revelation. In the New Testament, there are 26 occurrences of this term, leukos in Greek, white. 16 of them are in the book of Revelation, so well over half. 8 of the 16 refer to clothing, and the other 8 of those 16 refer to some aspect of the heavenly realm, in the book of Revelation. So the connection, most scholars think here is Daniel 11:35 or Daniel 12:1. And maybe verse 10. I'm going to go to Daniel 12, just so you can, catch the drift here. It says here, let's go back to 11:35 first, then might as well hit them all. So 11:35, we have this language here. It's talking about the holy ones, the faithful ones in Daniel 11. And it says here, some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. So you have this time of the end, appointed time connection with being made white, okay? Then you go to chapter 12, At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. So here we have a reference to this time, and we're going to talk about this time of trouble a little bit in this episode. It's connected to, since there's a reference there to this time that goes back to chapter 11, verse 35, where we get being made white, and here in 12:1 you get the same people found written in the book. It doesn't say book of life, but just the book. And so you can already tell, again, this is what John is drawing on. He's drawing on something in Daniel 11:35. He's combining that with Daniel 12:1, because back in Daniel they seem to be connected anyway. You go down to Daniel 12:10. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, so on and so forth. So there's this connection with being made white at some time of trouble. That is, of course, in Daniel 12, the Old Testament context is very clearly the day of the Lord, the end of days, that sort of thing. And so this is kind of easy for scholars to look at and figure out, initially anyway, what Daniel is angling for, what he's drawing on. So white, at the least, denotes membership or belongingness for those who overcome, at the end of days, in this time of trouble. And white, of course, would also be associated with the heavenly realm in the book of Revelation. Now, that's not really news, but we often fail to think about what that combination of things means, sort of where it goes, where it leads, because we fail to connect it with other terms that describe the appearance or transformation of believers, elsewhere. And so Beale, for instance, in his book on John's use of the Old Testament and Revelation, he's going to do this. He's going to say, well, this is kind of interesting. We've got white, we've got being made white, we've got a reference to white clothing. Again, we're drawing on Daniel, so it's some sort of, end of days, day of the Lord kind of thing. But he doesn't just let it drop there, which a lot of commentators do. He asked the question, well, okay, believers transformed into whiteness or white garments. What else happens to believers in the book of Revelation? Okay, so here's what he writes. Christians taste the inaugurated fruits of some of the latter-day promises cited in the 7 letters even before they die. The inaugurated aspect of some of the promises, and again, he's talking about an already but not yet thing when he uses the word inaugurated. The inaugurated aspect of some of the promises can be discerned from an analysis of Revelation 2:7, in which we've talked about in earlier episodes, as well as from the concluding promises of each of the letters. And he says, if you compare, for instance, Revelation 2:26 and 27, to him that overcomes, I will put him over the nations. Revelation 3:21, to him that overcomes, he will sit on my throne. It's this shared rulership thing. I will give to him the morning star. So these are transformative things. This is something that's going to happen to believers. And since the kingdom is already present in some way, it's an already but not yet sort of thing. And so what Beale's going to say here is this being transformed, we need to think of it in terms of those, the already but not yet as well. So he says, if you go to Revelation 2:10, there we get a reference to crowns, along with Revelation 3:11 and 4:4. We have white garments in Revelation 3:4 and 5, of course. We also get it in 18, but we also get the white mention in Revelation 4:4 and 6:11. In fact, writes Beale, if the process of conquering for the believer is completed at one's death, then it is probable that the promises to the conquerors begin to some degree, also at death. He's connecting these things, in other words. Now, let's take crowns, for instance, when, he's lumping all this together, being made white, white garments, crowns, put over the nations, given the morning star, ruling with Jesus, sitting on his throne. All these things that show up in Revelation 2 and Revelation 3. Now, I don't know about you, but every time I heard in the past, some sermon about, crowns in heaven, it's always about winning a prize, like you win a contest or something. But if you're catching the drift here, it's really about rulership. Okay, shared rule as a member of God's ruling family body. In other words, as a member of God's council. The terminology of things like crowns and of this appearance, you basically, you're transformed to look like what you are, to look like one of those guys already in the heavenly realm who are, again, members of God's host, members of God's council. Angels always being depicted in white, and here we have believers in white, and we've got the language of the holy ones in the New Testament applied to believers. There are all sorts of pieces to this that we fail to sort of put together, and where they all lead to is the transformation of the human believer to membership and a participatory role in God's counsel. That's where all this language leads. But we tend to sort of look at little pieces of it, in sermons or whatnot, and make it about either winning a contest or performance on earth or something like that. And it's just so much bigger than that. It's not that those things are nowhere in the picture. It's that's not the picture. That's not the whole picture. It's not even the most important part of the picture. Now, Owen, in his Revelation commentary, picks up on the same strategy that, hey, let's look at how else believers are transformed in the language and combine all these things to get a fuller picture. He picks up on something that a lot of other commentators don't, at least in the resources I have. He picks up on the line, "They will walk with me in white." Okay, the walking. And he says this: the language of Revelation 3:4 is very possibly influenced by Genesis 5:22 and 6:9, where it is said of both Enoch and Noah that they, quote, walked with God. Now, I would say this, though Owen spots this, he, in his commentary, at least he sees it, but he merely comments about it as some sort of language that is indicative of a relationship with God. And that's certainly true of both Enoch and Noah, okay? For sure that's part of what's going on. But in Enoch's case, there's a little bit more going on because Enoch is translated. He is taken into God's presence, into the council throne room, so to speak. So there's a little bit more going on. Now, in this regard, I'm going to recommend a book. Again, I typically recommend, books, and I try not to land on resources that are really expensive. This one actually exists in paperback, so it's not bad. It's part of the Library of New Testament Studies, and the author is Laszlo, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the last name correctly, but Galluz. It's Galluz. And the book is entitled The Throne Motif in the Book of Revelation. Again, it's part of the Library of New Testament Studies series. And I just want you to listen to what he does with this kind of language, especially the crown and the throne room, because, newsflash to readers of Revelation, after we're done with chapter 3, after this whole, you're made white, the crowns, and you sit with me on my throne and you inherit the nations, we go into chapter 4. And what's chapter 4? Revelation 4 and 5. It's a divine council scene. Earlier in the history of this podcast, we had Dr. Bandy on, who did his dissertation on Revelation 4 and 5. We had him on for a specific episode about Revelation 4 and 5 being a divine council scene. And so we've been in this territory before. We are going to spend time on it, obviously, of our own when we get there in a couple weeks. But here's what Galluz says about that scene and in combination with some of this language here in Revelation 3 and really even back to Revelation 2. He says, the white color in this context evokes the notion of mercy, purity, equity, and judgment, the glory of God, victory, all these things, vindication with holiness and the color of heaven. Also, very often, two or more of these ideas are combined in the interpretation. When these visions that John has and then an angel will interpret, there's usually more than one thing going on. They usually get combined in the text. It seems that all these concepts, he writes, are inspired by the well-known white versus black antithesis prominent in the Bible, which conveys the interchangeable notions of vitality, life, light, holiness, and joy as contrasted to the inertia, darkness, evil, and sorrow on the other side. The white garments they wear are consistently related in Revelation to people faithful to God. Similarly, golden crowns, now catch this, are never ascribed to angelic beings in the book. So a crown is an obvious reference to shared rulership, but angels don't get it. They don't get crowns. We do. Okay? And you go back to Revelation 2. It's not, to make it sound a little bit like the book of Hebrews-ish, it is not to the angels that he says, to him that overcomes, I will put them over the nations. Or to him that overcomes, they will sit with me on my throne. Jesus doesn't say that to angels. They don't get crowns. Yes, they're already in white, and believers made white means, it's like the required form of dress now. You're part of this body, the divine council. But our status is actually higher than theirs. And again, that takes us back to Paul. Don't you know someday that you're going to judge angels? These are all pieces, again, of this larger picture, this larger idea. So back to Galuz, he says again, golden crowns are never ascribed to angelic beings in the book. John's careful choice of the term to designate the crowns of the elders also points in this direction. Instead of diadema, which we get the English word diadem, a term with limited reference to royal authority, Stephanos, is used here, which is capable of expressing more concepts simultaneously, including the idea of victory. So let me just stop here again. What he's saying is, it's interesting that John chooses Stephanos over diadema, because if it was diadema, it's only about rulership. But Stephanos, there's lots of other things looped in here that are associated with that term. One of which is victory, which makes good sense because he's talking to those who overcome, those who remain faithful, so on and so forth. So Stephanos includes royal authority, but it has some of these other aspects as well. And again, angels don't get any of these. It seems, back to Galuz, it seems that the imagery characteristic of this eminent group, white garments, golden crowns, and thrones, again, the elders are on the thrones, ties the elders to the overcomers of chapters 2 and 3, to whom these items are promised as a reward for conquering. So let me just stop here again. That's going to tip his hand that he looks at the elders as being symbolic of human believers, who are assisting in the rulership of God. Well, where do we, again, back to unseen realm, where do we get this, Yahweh and his elders language? It's from Isaiah. Okay, this language, shows up in Isaiah that at the end of days, Yahweh will be, proved among his elders, or, whatever the language is there. I mean, in other words, this council already exists, and now believers are moved into it, are grafted into it by virtue of this language. Galuz says the book's dominant symbol of authority is the throne. However, the motif is not the sole indicator of the concept. The author of Revelation employs additional symbolism to connote rule, using images such as sword, crown, robes, keys, rod, horns, and heads. Okay, and some of those we'll get to in later chapters. But basically, what he's arguing for is that, again, if you look at not just the things here in chapter 3, one or two words, if you look at the description of the believers here, using those terms, and you look at descriptions of believers elsewhere in the book, we haven't even gotten into the divine council scene in Revelation 4 and 5. We're still in the letters. If you even look that far, you're going to see a variety of ways to refer to the believer as co-rulers, inheritors of the status of membership in the divine council. But again, we typically, again, at least my experience has been, you're in church and it's some message about, crowns in heaven. It's very isolated. It lacks all of this backdrop, all of this background. It's a very tunnel vision look at a term when there's so much else going on. It's actually a good illustration of what we try to do, on the podcast. What I'm trying to do in Unseen Realm is that, look, a lot of this is already familiar to you, this terminology, these ideas, but unless you have the structure, unless you have the matrix, sort of built out for you, you can't really see the role that this term or this idea, this concept, this phrase plays, what it really means in its fuller extent, if you don't have the backdrop with you. If you don't have the matrix, if you don't have the mosaic, as the metaphor I used in Unseen Realm. And this is a good illustration of it. Let's move on to something else in verse 5. I will never blot his name out of the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time here because we've already done an episode on the book of life and other heavenly books. That's the podcast episode 89. But I do want to say a few things, and I'll loop some of that content in here just to not leave it bare. Book of life is a phrase that occurs 6 times in Revelation. So you get it here in verse 5, Revelation 3:5. You get it in Revelation 13:8, 17:8, 20 verse 12, and verse 15, and then 21:27. It has very ancient antecedents, and we go into this in a lot of detail in episode 89, but we go all the way back to Mesopotamia, where with something called the tablets. Recall Mesopotamians wrote on tablets; they didn't write in books. Okay, the tablets of destiny, and the fundamental ideas behind the tablets of destiny were: you had the gods, in other words, the divine council, the Mesopotamian version. They make decrees; they decree destiny; they determine what's going to happen. They interact with people on that level. Some of the tablets are really focused on the divine king. Specifically the Assyrian version, and there's one that says you are king because the gods want you to be king, that sort of thing. That's a little different than saying that the gods, the council, predestines every event in your life. When it comes to the king, it's like their choice of putting you in authority. The idea is that the gods choose the king, and then they prop up the king, and the king better fulfill his destiny because that's what the gods want, and the gods are keeping track of what the king does. Well, in some texts, that gets expanded out to just normal people, that in Mesopotamia, the gods are sort of watching. They decree destiny, and they keep an eye on things. When you move into the Old Testament and the Second Temple literature, it is God who decides the fates of nations, the fates of kings. So there's, it's a little bit like the Mesopotamian stuff, but the concept is a lot wider. And we talk about this specifically in the episode 89, where it could be recording things that happen to individuals, both good and bad. There is a sense of, again, keeping track of what people are doing and what people are doing to other people. There's this book of life that really applies, again, to those whose believing loyalty is with the God of Israel as opposed to something else. So there's judgments, there's record keeping. Again, these are the motifs. We've talked about this actually on the podcast a number of times. Owen, in his commentary again, picks up on some of this. Again, I don't want to repeat episode 89 here. There's a lot to it, but there are commentators who are aware this is a very old idea, and it is connected to God's bureaucracy, God's council, His assembly. This whole record keeping. If you've read my angels book, the whole idea of the guardian angel, the angel who keeps watch, is part of this complex of ideas. But Owen writes this in his commentary about this language at this particular point. He says the motif of a book of life in which the names of the saved are written, and the motif of the erasing of a person's name from such a book, are extremely widespread in the Old Testament and early Judaism, sometimes used together and sometimes separately. The possibility of having one's name erased from the book of life suggests that fidelity to God, rather than any type of predestinarian system, is the reason for having one's name inscribed in the book of life in the first place. I'm going to read that over again. Because again, we tend to read these things as though, well, like God wrote all those names in there beforehand, and once they're written, God can't unwrite them, He can't erase them. And, in other words, it's this confusion with the concept of election that divorces election from believing loyalty. And I've commented before that I think election in the Old Testament is fundamentally misunderstood. Again, Israel was elect, no kidding. Duh. Okay, that's very obvious. It's just too bad that a lot, maybe even most Israelites, you're not going to see in heaven. Why? Because there's this thing called the exile. Okay, a grand apostasy of the elect. And then you have the non-elect, those who aren't Israelites, being grafted in. Well, how does that happen? If everything's written in these books beforehand, how can that change? Again, what Owen is saying is it's wrong-headed to think of this in predestinarian modes, because things do change. Okay, the non-elect become elect. The elect, again, go off and worship other gods, and they're out. Okay, things change. We have fundamentally misunderstood this idea. So Owen says, this is what we got. It seems, I'm going to read it again, the possibility of having one's name erased from the book of life, that's a change, suggests that fidelity to God, okay, let's just say believing loyalty, rather than any type of predestinarian system, is the reason for having one's name inscribed in the book of life in the first place. The traditional character of this pronouncement in Revelation 3:5 is evident in the close parallel to verses 5a and b in the Odes of Solomon 9:11, that's a pseudepigraphical book, where the two motifs of conquering and of having one's name inscribed in a heavenly book are combined in a positive formulation. And he quotes Charlesworth's Old Testament pseudepigrapha here in this passage, which says, "Put on the crown in the true covenant of the Lord, and all those who have conquered will be inscribed in his book." So there you have, this believing loyalty idea, loyalty to Yahweh. And in Revelation's case, it's loyalty to the gospel. You don't trade the gospel for anything else. You keep believing. I mean, I know you've heard me say that 100 times now, especially if you recently listened to the series in Hebrews, but that's the point. You keep believing. That's the only issue. That's the book of life issue right there. That you have aligned yourself with the gospel. You believe in the gospel for everlasting life, and you don't believe anything else. You don't throw your loyalty anywhere else to any other god or any other promises about how this or that religion or God can bring you salvation. You turn your back on all of them, and you align yourself right here to the cross event and the resurrection. Okay, this is what you do. Back to Owen. In Judaism and early Christianity, the primary setting of the Book of Life motif was the judgment scene in which God is seated upon his throne, surrounded by the heavenly courtiers. Daniel 7, 9, and 10, Revelation 20, verses 12 through 15, 1 Enoch 47, 3, 1 Enoch 90, 20. The origin of this metaphor is certainly that of the ancient Near Eastern royal court, where records were made available to the king for dispensing justice, though the idea itself goes back to Sumerian and Akkadian literature, and again back to the tablets of destiny. On adds elsewhere, the motif of having one's name erased then or blotted out from the book of life is a metaphor for judgment based on the notion of expulsion or disenfranchisement from the record of citizenship. Originally, however, to be blotted out of the book of life meant to die, Exodus 32, verses 32 and 33, Psalm 69, 27 and 28, Isaiah 4:3, but it's bigger than that. So the point is that, again, this whole idea, election, again, this sort of predestinarian model that we often have in our heads is really not how we should be reading this. Election didn't guarantee eternal life for Israelites. Again, we have this thing called the exile. It's a really big deal in biblical history. It's fundamentally, foundationally important in biblical theology, the exile. Okay, the exile happened because there was a grand apostasy. The elect go after other gods. I mean, there are a few things more obvious in the Bible than that, if you read your Old Testament. And so he's saying, look, we need to be thinking about this. You're in the book of life, but you can be erased. The basis of that cannot be predestination, because if it was predestinated, we wouldn't even be talking about changes here. The basis for the language has to be believing loyalty. Okay, it's very consistent. Now, that brings us to Revelation 3, 7, and 8. We're going to skip the keys stuff for part 2. So I'm going to go right to verse 9, which says this: "Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Now, again, we've commented on this before in prior episodes about the synagogue of Satan and what that might be, and so on and so forth. I want to, add a little bit, but we're not going to go back and rehearse, what that is or where it is and all this sort of stuff. There's something in here that we need to add to it. And it's this last part, they will learn that I have loved you. Okay, these Jews, again, who are opposing believers, they're opposing the messiahship of Jesus, but that's not all they're opposing. Think about it. This is a letter to one of the churches in Asia, okay, Asia Minor. Okay, there's a lot of Gentile turf here. Okay, the synagogue of Satan, if that's Pergamon, that's a Gentile city, okay? So what John is saying here, and of course he's the mouthpiece for the Lord in these letters, is that they, the Jews, will learn that I have loved you. Well, who's you? Well, it's Jews and especially, including Gentiles in the family. Anyone, Jew or Gentile, whose believing loyalty is aligned to me, that's who's going to have eternal life. They, the Jews, again, are going to learn that I have loved you, and you includes Gentiles substantially, especially in these letters. Now, again, I'm bringing that up for a specific reason. Let me just go to Beale and Carson in their commentary, and they take us back to the Old Testament for some of this stuff. And again, it's going to sound a little bit familiar, but I want to make a very specific point here. Beale and Carson, in their Old Testament and the New Testament commentary, write, the clause, I will make them, okay, in order that or so that they will come and bow down before your feet. Okay, that's in Revelation 3:9. Is a collective allusion to Isaiah 45:14, 49:23, 60:14, and Psalm 86:9. I'm going to look up a few of these. So Isaiah 45:14. Thus says the Lord, the wealth of Egypt, the merchandise of Cush, and the Sabaeans, the men of stature, shall come over to you and be yours. They shall follow you. They shall come over in chains and bow down to you. They will plead with you, saying, surely God is in you. There's no other, no God besides him. So it's a reference to Gentile people from the nations, admitting that, Yahweh is the true God. So Isaiah 49, let's see, what was the verse? 49:23. Kings shall be your foster fathers, their queens your nursing mothers. With their faces to the ground they shall bow down to you. Against a reference to Zion and to Israel. And they will lick the dust of your feet. And you will know that I am the Lord. Those who wait for me shall not be put to shame. So we've got a series of verses here. I'm not going to look them all up, but the series of verses is about Gentile conversion or Gentile acknowledgement of who the true God is. So Beale and Carson write this. These Old Testament texts predict that the unbelieving Gentiles would come down and bow down at Israel's feet and to Israel's God in the last days. This prophecy has been fulfilled in an apparent ironic fashion in the Gentile church, which has become true Israel by virtue of its faith in Christ. In contrast, here's the irony, the ethnic Israelites in Philadelphia fulfill the role of the Gentiles. They're the opposition. They continue, likewise, the prophecy that God would demonstrate his love for persecuted Israel before the nations seems to be fulfilled in an ironic manner. Quote, they will know that I have loved you, in Revelation 3:9b, is applied to the Gentile-dominated church instead of ethnic Israel, as apparently in, and then he gives a grocery list of passages, Isaiah 43:4. Let's just go to that one. Isaiah 43:4. Let's go back up. Verse 1 is, now thus says the Lord, he who created you, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you. So he's talking to Israel. Here's verse 4, because you are precious in my eyes and honored, and I love you. I give men in return for you, peoples in exchange for your life. Again, God disinherits the nations, but Israel is his own family. Fear not, for I am with you. I will bring your offspring from the east. From the west I will gather you. I will say to the north, give up to the south, do not withhold. And you get into this regathering language, so on and so forth, from the nations. So it's this reversal theme. We've seen this a lot, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, all this sort of stuff. And what Beale and Carson are trying to say here is that, this language in Revelation 3:9, that pits the Jews, ironically enough, as the opposer to the followers of Yahweh. I mean, Yahweh is the Jewish God. How does this work? Well, it works this way because a lot of the Jews, either in the Old Testament time, they abandoned the worship of Yahweh and worshiped other gods. In the New Testament time, they have rejected Yahweh's Messiah, who was Yahweh incarnate. They've rejected Jesus. And so now they are set in the opposition role, and the people of God become instead Gentiles. It's a lot of Gentiles. If this sounds like Romans 11, then you kind of know what I'm angling for here. We've talked about this before in earlier episodes. We've spent a good bit of time on the whole notion about Israel being rejected and the Gentiles grafted in, Romans 11, so on and so forth. This is essentially Revelation 3:9 is following that same trajectory. It's about this reversal, this ironic situation where the Old Testament people of God are now the opposers. They're opposing Yahweh's plan. They're opposing their own God's plan because it included Gentiles. And they're persecuting believers. They're persecuting these believers. And they're just on the wrong side. They're on the wrong side. Now, in the previous, episode or two here in Revelation, I've made the comment that it's incoherent to take this language as some sort of, generally anti-Semitic posture, and it is incoherent. Now, I realize a Jew today who rejects Jesus could read it that way, that, John's just targeting Jews. He doesn't like Jews. The New Testament's an anti-Semitic book. But to do that, you'd have to forget or ignore a couple of things. First, you'd have to ignore that the writer is a Jew. Second, you'd have to ignore the fact that the comments are aimed at a subset of Jews, those who are persecuting Christians. Not every Jewish person's doing that. The immediate context is persecution. Third, and we really haven't mentioned this before, you'd also have to ignore how in New Testament theology, the Jewish opposition, the Jewish antipathy, toward the people of God, toward the followers of Jesus, who's the Jewish Messiah, but the Jewish opposition to that is something that God did in part to be a catalyst toward the salvation of Israel. In other words, ultimately, it's something God's going to use to turn Israel back to himself. And that's Romans 11. So Romans 11 is not talking about salvation based on original ethnicity. Like, if you're ethnically a Jew, God sets you aside, but don't worry, you're still going to be in because you're an ethnic Jew. That has nothing to do with it. It ultimately has to do with believing loyalty, and it's a very consistent theology. I want you to listen to Romans 11 again in light of this. I'm going to read verses 17 through 23, and verse 23 is going to have something in it that really clarifies what's going on in Romans 11, and just generally, it's going to fit in with all this conversation we've had in many cases, many episodes about believing loyalty. So Romans 11:17, Paul says, "But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others." So some of the branches broken off. Again, this Jewish, the original plant has branches broken off. Jews will reject the Messiah, and now you Gentiles get grafted in. You, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. Do not be arrogant toward the branches. You newcomers, you Gentiles, don't be arrogant at the ones who were broken off, the Jews. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That's true. Verse 20, Paul says that's true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. Catch that. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through works? No, through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, the original branches, neither will he spare you. In other words, they didn't get in by ethnicity. You ain't getting in by ethnicity either. You must believe. Verse 22, note then the kindness and severity of God, severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness, grace, the chesed. We did a whole episode on loving kindness, the loving loyalty, allegiant loyalty. Okay, it works both directions, God to us to God. Otherwise, Paul says, you too will be cut off. Okay, as we have fundamentally misunderstood Old Testament election, yes, I believe we have fundamentally carried that misunderstanding into the New Testament era as well. Okay, again, I just think election is fundamentally misunderstood across the board. We think that if, again, I'm just doing traditions at random here. I got baptized in the church, I got sprinkled, I got this, I got that. I was made a member of the covenant community. This is a sign and a seal of the covenant. Well, yeah, it is. But hey, you don't have eternal life because of signs and seals. You have eternal life. And those are just markers. Those are things that put you into a community where you can hear the gospel. But guess what? Newsflash, pro tip, you have to believe it, and you got to keep believing it. You can't just pray a prayer or go through a confirmation and say, well, I can now, I'm past that benchmark. Now I can do whatever I want. I can believe whatever I want. I can believe that in no God at all. I'm in, I'm good. I can just think and believe and do what I want. Wrong. It's just wrong. And it's not that you're meriting salvation. This is not works salvation. It is a continued faith. It is a continued belief. It is a continued believing loyalty in the one thing that will give you everlasting life. And it ain't you. It ain't your works. It's the work of Christ on the cross. You have to remain loyal to that. Now, in the last verse, I didn't get to verse 23 yet. I'm going to go back to verse 22. Note then the kindness and severity of God, severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And here's verse 23. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. So the elect become non-elect and can become elect again. I'm hoping you see how the way Christianity has traditionally thought about election just really doesn't work with this kind of language. Okay, if you're like a high Calvinistic system, I don't know what you're doing with this. The elect become non-elect, and then they become elect again if they don't continue in their unbelief. Huh? It makes really good sense if election doesn't mean salvation, if it means something else, if it means access to the truth. The Israel alone had access to the truth. They had a relationship with the true God. God comes to them. He comes to Abraham. He creates them out of Abraham and Sarah. He starts over after he disinherits humanity at Babel. So they're new. I mean, these are all acts of God. God continues coming to them, making covenants, making promises, bailing them out, from this and that, and crisis and whatnot. Brings them to the land, gives them the temple, all this kind of stuff, and then they just go off and worship other gods anyway. Election was access to the truth. That's what it is. Okay, it is a beginning point. It is an introduction. It is a revelation toward what you must believe to have eternal life. And by believe, it doesn't mean that you pray a prayer, you pray an incantation. Okay, the biblical theology is not about shamanistic practice. I went through a ritual and now I'm have eternal life. No. The only thing that matters is, do you believe the gospel right now? This is why the book of Hebrews, this is why the book of Revelation, this is where we're at, book of Revelation. It's this keep believing, continue, to him that overcomes, to him that endures to the end. It doesn't mean like doing spiritual push-ups. Okay, it works. It's not earned. It's not merited. It's that, are you refusing to switch loyalties? Don't switch loyalties. Believe the gospel and keep believing it. If you believe the gospel, you are going to be secure forever. You're going to have everlasting life. But we have confused this kind of, again, what is said about election just doesn't jive with this kind of language in Romans 11, and it doesn't jive with going back to Revelation, because Revelation 3:9, again, where we're at in this little segment, he dips back into the Old Testament to remind them, look, okay, you got your opponents, these Jewish people, they hate us because we follow Jesus, they reject the Messiah, but they're going to learn. They're going to learn because their Old Testament actually told them this, that the outsiders are going to become insiders. Okay, there's all these passages where the Gentiles acknowledge who the true God is and come to worship him. That's what's happening here in real time. When John's writing these letters, Gentiles are coming to the faith. We have these churches in Asia Minor, and they are the people of God. They are a new Israel, okay, reborn, okay, but they're Gentiles. And John, just like Paul, was saying, you should have expected this. The Jews should have expected this and not opposed it. But here we are. They're opposing it, and they're going to learn. They're going to learn what they should have learned already, because John's drawing his intellectually from these different passages. So again, I just wanted to rabbit trail on that a little bit. Revelation 3:10. Let's just go there. It says this: because you have kept my word about patient endurance. There we go again. Patient endurance. Keep believing, okay? Because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world, to try those who dwell on the earth. Now that is not a reference to, that's not saying, hey, if you keep believing, nothing bad is ever going to happen to you. It's a reference to the ultimate day of the Lord, to the ultimate judgment. You're not going to be part of that. You're not going to be part of that. If you're in the family of God, you're not going to be part of that. That's his point. It's probably an allusion again to Daniel 12:1, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that. We've hit Daniel 12:1 a little bit before, but just again to read that to you. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people. There shall be a time. Here's the point. There shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time, your people will be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Again, if you're in the book of life, Daniel doesn't use that term, but John does. If you're in the book of life, you're not going to be, at this ultimate judgment. You're not going to suffer that. That's his point in Revelation 3:10. Revelation 3:12, there's a couple of things to hit here. It says this: the one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it. And I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. Now, we talked about Revelation 3:12 last week in relation to hidden manna, the white stone, the name inscribed on the stone. That was the last episode. But here we got another one of these. There's just a few other things to say here. Again, we're just supplementing a little bit. Last time we had to dip into Revelation 3, and we're here in Revelation 3, so we can add a few things. Now, we talked in relation to the manna, the stone, the name inscribed. We talked about, that's really name theology. Okay, it was Old Testament name theology applied to the believer. And I'm going to add a little bit to that here from Beale's book on the Old Testament and Revelation. This is not his Revelation commentary. This is a different book. He writes here, the concluding mention in Revelation 2:17 of the new name having been written on a stone is an example of a brief allusion conveying substantial prophetic overtones from the Old Testament. Revelation 3:12 reveals that the name in 2:17 is a pregnant reference to the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and that is Christ's new name, which was written on the believer. Now that much we hit last time. If you remember back in Revelation 2, we hit these phrases about the hidden manna, the white stone with a name on it. Beale and others took us to Revelation 3:12, and so Revelation 3:12 essentially answers the question. And he says right here again, Revelation 3:12 reveals that this name inscribed back in chapter 2 is the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, and of course, Christ's new name. They were not, the name there is not, back in chapter 2, was not a reference to the believer's name being inscribed. It was rather these other things. Okay? So to continue here with what Beale says, He says, separate meanings are not to be assigned to each of these names. If you notice in Revelation 3 there's a list. Name of my God, name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes out of heaven, from my God, and Christ's, my Christ's new name. So he's saying that those aren't like three different things. They're not, they don't have separate meanings. But he writes, they all refer to the intimate eschatological presence of God and Christ with his people, as expressed most clearly later in Revelation 22, 3 and 4, which reads, the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it, in the New Jerusalem, and his bondservants shall serve him, and they shall see his face, and his name shall be on their foreheads. So he's saying all of these things really refer to the same thing. Now, all of that leads Beale to a conclusion. He writes this. This conclusion is also pointed to by observing that the new name of Revelation 2:17 is an allusion to the prophecy of Isaiah 62:2 and 65:15 about Israel's new standing in the future. The saints of Israel are referred to figuratively as Jerusalem, which, quote, will be called by a new name, unquote. Again, they're not different personal names. It's the name of God. There, the new name designates Israel's future kingly status. That's Isaiah 62:3. It's a direct allusion there. It also refers to restoration of Yahweh's covenantal presence. That's Isaiah 62:4. That is the same significance for the name in Isaiah 56 and 65. The promised blessings of this prophecy will be fulfilled among those in the church, the latter-day Israel, who do not compromise. Isaiah's prophecy of Israel's restoration to God's latter-day presence lies as the substratum also for all the other references in the book to the believer's name and to God's or Christ's name. Now, essentially what Beale's arguing for is that, look, all this name stuff, the inscribed name, you get a host of names. Again, there's like 3 or 4 of these. He's saying, look, they all point to the same thing. This naming points to God being present, God's ownership over the believer, but corporately, those believers that get the new name, get the hidden manna, the white stone, the white garments, the stuff we've been talking about today, collectively, that is the new Israel. And if you think of the church as this new form of Israel, when you go back to these passages in Isaiah 62, Isaiah 65, he loops in Isaiah 56 here, all of these things that you see in the book of Revelation about getting a new name and having the presence of God with that new name. In the Old Testament, there are references to the end of days, newly redeemed, brought back Israel. In Revelation, they're said of these churches, which are predominantly Gentile. So again, what Beale's arguing for is that we need to remember when John dips into the Old Testament here for this language, if you go back to the Old Testament, it's only about this ethnic entity, Israel, this boots on the ground geographic entity, Israel. But when John is writing, John knows that the ultimate outcome of those things is not just a single nation, again, the size of New Jersey. That's my little throw in here. John's not thinking about New Jersey. There wasn't a New Jersey. But John's not thinking about isolated geography. John is thinking about these churches that are scattered in Asia Minor that are predominantly Gentile. And he says, look, I can say this about you, these churches, okay? I can say this about you, Gentiles, because you are a new Israel. You are the outcome of these things. And all Israel really is the family of God, the people of God. And it's not tied to any ethnicity or anything like this. It's tied completely, again, to where your loyalty is, who's your God, so on and so forth. So there's actually a lot of consistency across the Testaments, but you have this strong Gentile element in the New Testament. But John's argument, as he's dipping back into these Old Testament references, and especially back in verse 9, where we took our little rabbit trail from Romans 3:9 or Revelation 3:9 into Romans 11 about the Gentiles bowing down before your feet and so on and so forth. John's saying, look, you Jews that are really upset by this, you should have known again, because he's drawing on these passages that talk about Gentiles coming into the family of God, acknowledging who the true God is, bowing down to Yahweh. All this stuff's in your Bible. All this stuff is in your Hebrew Bible. You Jews that are opposing, the believers here in these churches. You should have known, and not only should you have known, but you should have submitted to it. You should have embraced it and accepted it. It should be your theology, but it isn't. And that puts you in opposition to your own God. And again, that's where the Romans 11 thing, it really comes in here. That you can be set aside, and you have been set aside, but you can also be grafted back in. So he's not. This isn't generally anti-Semitic stuff. It's very pointed. It's very theological, and it's very consistent with with reading their Old Testament and just submitting to it, just saying, okay, this is how it played out. But that's what their opponents are not doing. They refuse to do it. And so you get a lot of this Old Testament imagery that in its original, context, of course, applied only to ethnic Israel. But here, as John repurposes it, it's just a wider picture. Now we have the Gentile reality that these Old Testament passages talked about. So I feel quite free. John would say, I feel quite free to take these passages and use them to talk about Gentiles in the church. That is completely appropriate. That's how that language in the Old Testament played out. We're here in real time. This is how it played out. And if you don't like that, then you're in the really awkward position of being a Jew opposing your own God, which isn't a good place to be. So again, I think the takeaway for us with all this, we're sort of, most of us are Gentiles listening to this anyway, and we're used to this kind of thinking. I think that's a good reminder. I think it's also a good reminder if we take this whole Jew-Gentile thing back to Romans 11, and we can see how the way we're used to thinking about election just doesn't work, because the ones who are grafted in can be taken out. The ones who are taken out can be put back in. I don't know how that squares with a predestinarian model. I really don't. God predestinated where it ends. Okay, well, that's looking at the end. In the beginning, if something is predestinated, elect or non-elect, predestination language typically doesn't allow for changes in status. And that's what you have here. You have changes, and you actually have more than one change in some texts. It can go back and forth. So I think we need a little bit of an adjustment there, and we need to get our theology sort of more in line with the text. So that's one takeaway. And the other one is, I think, especially for this audience, what John's doing in Revelation 3, and also what he did in Revelation 2, a little, when he actually gets into the actual letters here, these two chapters, Revelation 2 and 3, in some sense, it prepares us for chapters 4 and 5, the divine council scene, because all this language that he uses of the believers transformed, again, the white garments, the white this, white that, all these transformations, the shared rulership, the fact that we have crowns and angels don't, this sort of thing, it sets us up, again, for this notion. Again, it's just part of this bigger picture that believers, again, become part of this body, part of the divine council on our glorification. And this is what Revelation is angling for. And again, we're not even at the scene yet. We're not even at the divine council scene, but John is prepping that. So even in these letters to churches, he's seeding that information, into these letters. And, ultimately it's supposed to be an encouragement to believers. This is your destiny. This is really difficult now, but this is ultimately your destiny. And I think, for us, it's a great reminder. It's a good takeaway, again, that we ultimately, where we're headed is shared membership, joint rule with Jesus. Again, to loop in Hebrews, our brother, in the council, Hebrews chapter 2. And we are participants in that council, in that assembly with him at the end of days.
I got a question. Some people were having some confusion on following your logic through the first part of Revelation here, and
I can't believe that anyone would be confused when we're talking about the book of Revelation. I can't believe it.
Mentioned it on the introduction of Revelation. So I think maybe people are just not following along here, but they're misunderstanding your angle that you're taking. And if John is writing what he saw and heard, then why are you saying things like, John wanted to hook back into the Old Testament, and that it sounds like that you're saying that John, these are John's thoughts and his message to these churches, not John writing all he's experiencing or being told to write. So can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah. So if I can distill that question, the question is this a record, John's record of a vision, or is John thinking back into the Old Testament? And the answer is yes. Okay, both of these things can be true at the same time. All right, let's just put ourselves in real time with John, as it were. When John has a vision, he's not writing during the vision, because vision-like states, trance-like states, whatever we want to describe these things, they are what they are. He's not interrupting the angel and writing things down like a stenographer or something like this. He's not capturing it on video. He's experiencing something, and then after the fact, he sets it to writing. And in the process of setting it to writing, it's going to dawn on him, either because of what he knows in terms of the Old Testament or biblical theology, or he's going to be prompted by the Spirit of God to make connections, and he's going to make them. I mean, let's just use an example from the introduction. Solecisms. There's a couple dozen of these where John's grammar, his Greek grammar, is wrong. It's incorrect. Where everywhere else in the book, it's perfectly fine. And again, scholars have figured out that when this happens, the explanation is there's something that John's drawing on back in the Septuagint that he could convert to correct grammar, but he doesn't, because he wants you to sort of think about what's, why is he saying it that way instead of the better way to say this? And, he wants readers to go back and look at things. It's a way of drawing attention. And there are very clear instances in the book where John takes 2, 3, 4 passages from the Old Testament and mixes them. I mean, literarily, these are just a matter of looking up the Greek text that John has given us and going back and looking at the Septuagint. This is something that if you know Greek fairly well, your first, second year knowledge, you can just go check for yourself. That doesn't mean John didn't have a vision. Okay, it just means that both of these things can be simultaneously true. So John has this experience, then after the fact, he has to relate that experience to his audience. And in so doing, he's going to be doing the kinds of things that we're talking about here. So one doesn't cancel out the other. They work, in tandem. So that's my approach to this, because A, I don't deny that visions can happen to people like John, visions from God, and B, you can actually go look this stuff up textually and see what's being done. So I'm not of the mode to deny either, and don't see any compelling reason why I have to deny one or the other. Both of these things can be operative at the same time.
All right, Mike. Yeah, he's got to convey what he saw. So what better way to use the tools that he's familiar with and that people are familiar with?
Right. He's going to discern what the point is of what he's seeing, or he's going to be told by the angel. I mean, the angel could relate something in the Old Testament, and John, is going to, be alerted to this fact. And so after, he relates it to his audience, there's going to be some of this thing going on to make sure the audience doesn't miss the point. Inspiration is a human and supernatural enterprise. Both of these things are operative. One does not cancel out the other, nor should one cancel out the other. We shouldn't talk about the subject trying to avoid one or the other. This is, going back to what I say frequently on the podcast. If we deny the human element of inspiration, we undermine the doctrine in very significant ways. And if that sounds a little strange, maybe to a new listener, the short path is to go go Google that in a podcast transcript. But there's plenty of places on YouTube and whatnot where I'm talking about why we need a better view of inspiration, and you'll find out why I say that.
All right, sounds good. Well, Mike, we're wrapping up Revelation 3. This is part 2, so might as well just get into it.
Yes, we are. We might as well get into it. I mean, this will be a bit lengthy, but it's really interesting stuff. Again, it's the kind of stuff we like. It's the weird stuff. So this episode is, I've labeled it part 2 of Revelation 3, and we're taking as our point of focus Revelation 3:7. But this is also going to be related back to Revelation 1:18. And what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to start with Revelation 1:18, and then we'll hit Revelation 3:7 at some point and see how these two things go together. And it's the link between the two is this keys language. So let me just read the passages really. Revelation 3:7 says, "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, the words of the Holy One, the true One, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens." And then Revelation 1:18, I'm going to loop verse 17 into it so it just sounds more readable. It says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, 'Fear not, I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. And I have the keys of death and Hades.'" Now, there are several really excellent resources on this passage, Revelation 1:18, and related passages like chapter 3, verse 7. That give you its contextual roots. Now, I'm going to give you two sources here, two resources for those who are interested in really getting into the weeds. One of these is really easy to find, and the other one not so much. And the one that's easy to find is also inexpensive. And I want to give a hat tip here and a thanks to one of our listeners, Robert Cruikshank, for these recommendations, and they're quite good for this passage. Now, the one that isn't expensive and is easy to find is by Justin W. Bass, B-A-S-S. It's called, the title is The Battle for the Keys, Revelation 1:18 and Christ's Descent into the Underworld. And it's published by Wiffenstock. It's part of the Paternoster Biblical Monographs series, and it was published in 2014. Now, we're going to have Justin on as an interview. At least we're planning on it, so Lord willing, that'll happen. For a future interview. We're not going to talk so much about this book. We'll be focused on a different book. But this is, sort of an off-the-radar biblical theology book that really is, he does a great job with this. The book is blurbed and recommended by W. Hall Harris, who's a New Testament prophet, Dallas Seminary, and was a mentor to Justin during his dissertation process, and this is his dissertation. And some of you who have read Unseen Realm will recognize that name as well, Hall Harris. In the book Unseen Realm, I take Hall's view of the descent of Christ to the underworld, in Ephesians 4, and how that relates to Psalm 68 and all that kind of stuff. So this is going to be more of that. It's going to add more layers to it. The second source is by David Ahn, who I've referenced before in terms of his commentary on the book of Revelation. We dip into that almost every episode somewhere. But he has a book called Apocalypticism, Prophecy, and Magic in Early Christianity. This is a Morse Seebeck title, 2006. And this one is more expensive, a little harder to find, but both of these have a lot of really good contextual material for Revelation 1:18 and Revelation 3:7. And I'm going to be dipping into both during this episode, mostly Bass, but, also interacting with Ahn's work in this monograph. So let's take the two passages in the order they appear. They are, of course, related, but they're not identical. Okay, Revelation 1:17-18, again, just to refresh our memory. "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his right hand on me, saying, 'Fear not, I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades.'" Now, Ahn, in this Apocalypticism book, this monograph, says this: the phrase, "I have the keys to death and Hades," refers to the cosmic sovereignty to which Jesus has attained following the act of God raising him from the dead. All three elements are featured in the brief description of the Lamb in Revelation 5:6 as well. The Lamb was standing as though slain with 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. Here, standing refers to the fact that he's now living. In other words, he's not laying over dead, okay? Despite the fact that he was slain. And the 7 eyes, understood as the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth, is another symbolic way of emphasizing the sovereignty, in this case, of Jesus, who is the Lamb. Now, we talked about the eyes of the Lord running to and fro in a couple episodes and how that denotes God's oversight of everything, sovereignty. So that's familiar. But here, that the language in Revelation 5 is transferred to the Lamb who was slain but is now standing and raised. And again, that language harkens back to Revelation 1:17 and 18. Now, there's a grammatical issue that Owen points out in Revelation 1:18. He writes this a little bit further. The prophetic call narrative in Revelation 1:9 through 20 is a complex pastiche of imagery drawn from various sources. And boy, don't we know that. Owen says, a supernatural revealer like a son of man appears to John and claims to possess the keys, and he has here 2, death and Hades. Now, he translates it a little bit differently, and he has a footnote here. This is the grammatical issue. He says the genitives, tu thanatu and tu hadu. Genitive is, let me just break in here, is a grammatical term for the relationship of 2 nouns that follow each other, okay, or an article, plus a noun. So for those of you who had a little Greek, you know right away what we're talking about here, but there's different ways to understand the relationship of nouns. Let's just put it that way, in not just Greek, but any language. So Owen says these phrases could either be objective or possessive genitives. In other words, you could translate this, the keys to death and Hades. That would be the objective mode of understanding. Or you could translate it, the keys, belonging to death and Hades. That would be possessive. So one says the keys to death and Hades, like they're a place that you can go and unlock something. And the other one is more possessive, that death and Hades possesses, these keys, they belong to them. Owen says, if they are regarded as objective genitives, death and Hades must be understood spatially, as in Revelation 20, verses 13 and 14. In other words, they're places with spatiality. But if they are construed as possessive genitives, death and Hades must be understood as personifications, as in Revelation 6:8. So let me just break in here again. On saying both of these things happen with death and Hades in the book of Revelation. Sometimes it's a place, sometimes they're like persons or figures, entities, okay? Back to Owen. The first possibility is preferable, in this case, he says, this is his view, since death is never, to my knowledge, to his knowledge, described in ancient texts as possessing keys. And there are few, if any, ancient texts in which Hades is so described. Pausanias, he points out, describes a decorated table showing Plutus holding a key. Again, but the same text distinguishes him from Hades, whom he has locked up. So he's saying, look, I think it's he drifts away from the personification view. Now, personally, I think that's unnecessary, and what we're going to go through in this episode is basically going to be pushback on this point. I've already hinted that I favor personification a little bit. Bass argues at length for it, okay, and he has very good reasons for doing so. And you might say, well, this feels like a bit of a distinction without a difference, because, hey, the personified death and Hades are masters of a particular domain, so the other idea of the spatiality is still in play. I agree. I think both of these things, belong on the table, both of these perspectives. But I want to focus a little bit on the personification angle, at least initially here. So let's start with the Old Testament. Here's the question. Are death and Hades, Hades, the underworld, are they ever personified? Are they ever portrayed as figures, entities, deities, okay, elsewhere, especially in the Old Testament or in the literature that informs the terms used in the Old Testament? The answer to that is, oh, yeah, they are. Now, I'm going to refer to DDD here, Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible, and the article on death is written by John Healy, and he gives us a good survey, sort of the background to the Old Testament material. Now, what you need to know here is that in Hebrew, the Hebrew Bible, The term for death is, the noun anyway, is moat. That is the same word in Ugaritic, moat, and in Ugaritic, moat is a deity, part of a pantheon, okay? So this is going to be the backdrop for, again, the Old Testament use in certain passages of the term moat or death. But first we got to get the background material. So Healy writes, moat's absence from the Ugaritic cult, in other words, there's no rituals of sacrifices to moat, and his absence in personal names suggests that he was not a deity worshipped like others in the pantheon, but he's nevertheless a deity figure. In Ugaritic mythology, Mot is one of the main enemies of Baal, alongside Yam, the sea god, who, unlike Mot, was the object of cultic veneration to some extent. Mot overcomes Baal, and the latter has to descend into Mot's underworld domain. So the Baal cycle has this battle between Mot, death, and Baal. Baal loses, and Baal has to go into the underworld, okay? So what we read afterward is Baal is reported dead in the Ugaritic tablets. I'm not going to give you the KTU numbers. It's not important now. But the goddess Anat hunts for him, and she attacks Mot, who is vanquished. So she takes care of Mot. Baal revives, and the two protagonists fight. Eventually, Mot is forced to concede, at least temporarily. The details are, of course, far from certain. The main characteristic of Mot is that he is a voracious consumer of both gods and men. He has an enormous mouth and an appetite to match. In his voraciousness, Mot is closely associated with the underworld. Mot dwells in the underworld, which is an unpleasant, muddy place of decay and destruction. The role of Mot as a demonic force to be held in check is well illustrated in Ugaritic texts. Then he has a reference. Although there is no certain iconographic representation of Mot, there's no artwork that tells you what they thought Mot looked like. Such suggestions as have been made involve images of a god or demon carrying a scepter. In other words, he's a ruler. Okay, so this is the Old Testament Canaanite backdrop to Mot as an entity. Now, when you get into the Old Testament, Healy in the same article writes this. In Old Testament poetry, death is often personified. For example, Hosea 13:14. I'm just going to read Hosea 13:14. It won't be the last time that we reference that, perhaps, in this episode. It says, I shall ransom them, and again, the speaker is going to be God here. I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol. I shall redeem them from death. Now that there, it's kind of neutral, like a place. But then the verse says, O death, like death is being addressed, Mot is being addressed. Where are your plagues? O Sheol, O underworld, where is your sting? Compassion is hidden from my eyes. Now, some of you automatically, even though you didn't know that was Hosea 13:14, you've heard that language before, and it's in Paul. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, the place where the dead go. Where's your sting? Where's your victory? Again, the point is that death and the underworld here are portrayed as entities that can be spoken to, or in this case, teased or mocked by Hosea 13:14. Healy writes, in other texts, there is mention of specific characteristics of death, which have some sort of parallel in the picture of Mot painted by the Ugaritic texts. Thus, in Habakkuk 2:5, the insatiability of personified death is mentioned. Quote, this is what the verse says, whose greed is as wide as Sheol, and like death, he is never satisfied. Again, it's sort of anthropomorphic language. This may echo the background cultural tradition of Mot, but the comparison is with the insatiability of the arrogant man and does not directly touch on matters religious, Healy writes. The same idea, though applied to a personified Sheol, again the underworld, is found in Isaiah 5:14. Quote, therefore Sheol has enlarged its appetite and opened its mouth beyond measure, unquote. Again, this is anthropomorphic language used of Sheol. In some cases it's death, other cases it's Sheol, and portrayed as a person. And there's other passages that do this, but this is sufficient to make the point. Healy goes on and says, or let me just make the point here, because I think something Bass says here is a little bit better. In the Old Testament, Okay, we have this personification. In the rest of Second Temple literature, again, this is going to show up too, but everybody goes to Sheol in the Hebrew Bible, in Old Testament theology, because everybody dies. The only exceptions are people that God sort of exempts from this. And there's only two of these in the Hebrew Bible. There's Enoch and Elijah. So Bass, writing about the Old Testament, death and Hades, or actually Mot and Sheol, wants to make this point because he's going to do something again with it when he gets going here. He says there's no Old Testament instance of a true descent to and return from the underworld by a living human being. Let me just read that again. Let that sink in. There's no Old Testament instance of a true descent to and return from the underworld by a living human being. I could stop right there, and you probably are going to know, you're going to be already seeing the significance of Revelation 1:18 and 3:7 with this death and Hades thing. Because Jesus does that. He does descend, and he does return to the land of the living. He's not just revived in the underworld like Osiris or something like that. It goes, what happens with Jesus goes well beyond that, and it's something that just didn't happen in the Old Testament. So Bass, continuing, says, in fact, Enoch and Elijah are the only exceptions who can be found to have gone to heaven and remain there instead of Sheol or Hades before New Testament times. Jewish and Christian writings after the time of Jesus begin to speak of the Old Testament saints in heaven, such as Abraham and Isaac and Job's children, and the souls of the righteous that go to the third heaven, language like this. Deliverance from Sheol is the great hope of the faithful Israelite, and there is no evidence in the Old Testament that it had been fulfilled. The righteous are at peace in death, Isaiah 57:1 and 2, and they hope to be united with their bodies for a physical resurrection, Ezekiel 37:12 through 14, Isaiah 26:19, Daniel 12:2. But his point is that in the Old Testament, that never happens. They never get to experience that, in terms of what's written in the Old Testament. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we've got, soul sleep or anything like this, because, there are these expressions of hope. I'm going to go be with my fathers, buried with his fathers. And, we know from archaeology, we've been through this material elsewhere on the podcast, when we talk about like Psalms of Korah and, deliverance from Sheol and all this stuff. This ought to be familiar territory, but in case it's not, just want to hit a little of it. Again, the point is everybody goes to Sheol because everybody dies. The only two exceptions, Enoch and Elijah. Okay, we got them. And once you're in Sheol in the Old Testament, nobody ever gets out. There's hope that you will get out at the last day, that the Lord will take you out, will redeem the righteous. Okay, but there's no passage that says they do. In the intertestamental period, people start writing in this way, again, about that the deliverance, from Sheol is now like real, their perspective on, the afterlife shifts a little bit, or it develops a little bit to include this. And of course, in the New Testament, this is very plainly articulated in various passages. But it's Jesus who sort of makes it a reality for everybody, all the righteous anyway. Okay, so there's this growth in the way this is thought about, the afterlife is thought about, growth in understanding. That the hope becomes reality. And if you're looking at Old and New Testament, it's very clear who the one is who makes it a reality. That would be Jesus. Okay, first fruits of them who sleep. I mean, these phrases actually mean something in the context of the Hebrew Bible and just how this whole subject is thought about. So Bass, going on, notes that in some passages, at least one, clearly, explicitly, well, that's a better way to say it, Sheol, okay, and let me just read it. Being gathered to one's fathers, okay, this idea of going to be with your loved ones, is parallel with Sheol in Genesis 49:29. If being gathered to one's fathers or sleeping with your fathers is parallel with Sheol, then it is clear that even the righteous go to Sheol, even the ones who expect a positive experience, maybe expect, something more, to be with the Lord, as certain Psalms say. So everybody goes to Sheol, righteous and unrighteous. Nobody gets out in the Old Testament, even though that is the hope of the righteous. So that's sort of a summary of Old Testament thinking when it comes to, what happens when you die. Now, Bass wants to make that point again, because he's later going to point to how Jesus is the unique factor here. He's the one that makes it a reality, so to speak. Not just so to speak, but really. But in biblical theology, Jesus is the turning point. He's the linchpin to all this. But then he goes on and he says we need to say something about personification language too. Now, just think about it before I even get into this. We've talked a little bit about personification already, but I'm going to do a little bit more here with what Bass has written. Everybody goes to this place. Everybody dies, so there's the death problem. Everybody goes to the underworld, okay? And it's not really a great place. I mean, yep, you might, if you're fortunate, you might get to see your loved ones and all that, but you're still there. You're still like a prisoner. You're still never going to get out. You hope to get out to be with the Lord directly, to experience His presence. Okay, that's even better than being gathered to your fathers. Okay, you want to be with the Lord that you serve, that you worship, that you believe in, so on and so forth. That's the hope. But death and the underworld are in your way. They hold you prisoner. It's as though you're in a cell and they have keys. Again, it's prison metaphor. It's inescapability. This kind of metaphor. Think in those terms. Wouldn't it be great if somebody could come down there and basically take the lunch money from death and the underworld, take the keys, and let those people out that are aligned with Him, that are righteous, that follow Him? I mean, when you start thinking in those terms, you're thinking of spiritual warfare, you're thinking of divine warrior conflict, you're thinking of some kind of battle thing. You're thinking of somebody going down there and, like I said, taking their lunch money. Okay, I'm here now. Hand them over. The keys are mine, not yours any longer. There's a spiritual war, a spiritual battle with death and Hades, and Jesus is going to win that fight. That's the imagery that is lurking behind Revelation 1:18 and Revelation 3:7. But let's go, now that I've tipped the hand here, let's go back to the Old Testament. Bass has a nice summary of personification language. And part of it reads as follows. This is Old Testament stuff now. Many see this personified figure, death, as Mot, the Canaanite god from Ugaritic texts, with very similar characteristics to death in the Old Testament. We've already hinted at that with Healy's article. To illustrate, Bass says, death uses waves of the sea against his victims, 2 Samuel 22:5 and 6. He uses cords and snares, Psalm 17:5 through 6. Okay, Psalm 114:3, Proverbs 13:14, so on. He ascends through windows, Jeremiah 9:21. He kills, Job 18:13, Jeremiah 18:21. Death terrorizes people, Psalm 54:5. He consumes, Job 15:21. He's never satisfied, Habakkuk 2:5. He crushes, Job 30:23. He speaks, Job 28:22. He shepherds, people under his ownership, Psalm 48:15. He is the enemy of man, Song of Solomon 8:6. He has weapons, Psalm 7:13. He's sent by God, Isaiah 9:7, Habakkuk 3:13. He meets people, Proverbs 24:8, Daniel 2:9, and he can be called upon, Job 17:14. It's all personification language. Similarly, Sheol, Hades, not just death, but the Hades, the place, is predominantly the realm of the underworld, but also can be personified as a being that unleashes terror. Sheol, or Hades, is personified through the Old Testament as seizing his victims, Job 24:19. Never being satisfied, Proverbs 27:20. He's an irresistible power, again, Song of Solomon 8:6. Terrorizes with weapons, again, Psalm 17:6. Has a house, Job 17:13 and Job 30:23. has a hand, Psalm 48:15 and 16, has a belly, Jonah 2:3, has a mouth to feed on his victims, Isaiah 5:13, and can be embittered, at least in the Septuagint, Isaiah 14:9, and is naked before God, Job 26:6. So again, this is all personification language. This is his point. Now, you take all that and you see the same thing in Second Temple Jewish literature and Greco-Roman literature. Bass has a whole chapter dedicated to the personification of death and Hades in Greco-Roman literature and Second Temple material. Here's a short paragraph from it. Beginning in Homer, Hades is personified as the god of the underworld and is the brother of Zeus. Moreover, the underworld is predominantly personified as the god Hades. Hades is, quote, horrible and, quote, the most hated of all the gods. Hades was worshipped in a temple near Elis in Greece. He is also pictured as judge of the dead. Hades is simultaneously portrayed not only as the god of the underworld, but also the very realm of the underworld that houses the souls of the dead. The dead are frequently referred to as entering the house of Hades. There is a river or lake that is the boundary between the dead and the living, and a ferryman that takes the dead across to pass through the gates of Hades. In Greek mythology, even death is personified as a demon or a monster from the underworld who is the sacrificer of the dead, quote unquote. It is clear that the Greeks sometimes personified Hades as a god of the underworld and simultaneously understood Hades as the abode or realm of the dead. In other words, to the Greek mind, they're both on the table, just like we said earlier. Finishing with Bass, he says, I believe this Greek portrayal of Hades as ruler over the dead and realm of the dead find clear parallels in the Old Testament and especially in Revelation. Again, Second Temple writers noted all this stuff. I'm not going to bother to read all of the whole section here. I'll just a few sentences. Here's some Second Temple Jewish examples. The Book of Wisdom makes clear that God did not create death, Wisdom 1:13. It was through the devil's envy that death entered into the world, Wisdom 2:24. Death can be seen as a realm or state of being or personified. To illustrate, death can be summoned by mankind to make a covenant, Wisdom 1:16. Death is summoned by God to take Abraham. That's the Testament of Abraham 8:9 through 12 and 16 through 20. Death decrees things, Sirach 41:2 and 3, has a hand, Song of the Three Jews 188. So on and so forth. Swallows up sinners, 1 Enoch 56:8. Oppresses people, 1 Enoch 63:11. Is destructive, Sibylline Oracles 3.393. He's a dragon that feeds on the wicked, 3 Baruch 4:6, and must be tamed. Apocalypse of Abraham 10:11. Again, just on and on and on. But the whole point is that when you get up to the New Testament, there's a long history of thinking about death and the underworld. Death, we'll use the Revelation language, death and Hades, as being both a place and an entity, a supernatural being. They're both in view. When you get to the New Testament, Bass writes this, more specifically, the book of Revelation uses Hades 4 times, always paired with death, and the 2 of them are personified agents of evil that Christ will and has overcome. Revelation 1:18, Revelation 6:8, Revelation 20:13 and 14. Those are the 4 passages where they're paired. However, Hades as a city with gates and souls dwelling within it is still clearly present in Revelation as well, Revelation 20:13. Death is also personified throughout the New Testament. In a footnote, he lists these references, Romans 5:14 and 17, Romans 6:9, 1 Corinthians 15:26, 54 and 55, 2 Timothy 1:10, Hebrews 2:14, and then you get into Revelation. He says, so death is personified a lot, but only Hades is personified in Revelation. These 4 passages where they're paired are also the only 4 places in the New Testament where death and Hades appear together. So it's only those 4. Bass writes, the author of Revelation is the only writer of the New Testament who continues to portray death and Hades as a duo of terror against mankind, as has been shown to be somewhat normative in the Old Testament and Second Temple literature. So all of that to say, look, what he's going to say about this has deep roots in the Hebrew Bible, Second Temple Jewish literature, and Greco-Roman thinking. And that is this whole idea that Christ is going to descend to this realm and defeat death and Hades in terms of spiritual warfare, like divine entities, supernatural agents. And I'll use the phrase again, take their lunch money. He's going to take the keys by force, as it were, and they're going to be dethroned. They're going to be put out of a job. Okay? They are no longer going to be owners of these keys. So, again, this is the imagery to keep in mind. Keys, he says on 59 and 60, keys had a very important place in the ancient Jewish and Greco-Roman world. The Jewish, Roman, and Greek writers wanted to present their gods as the one who hold the keys to the underworld. The imagery used to describe both the underworld and heaven is consistent in the ancient world. The underworld was presented as protected by strong and impenetrable gates that required keys to enter. Think of the prison metaphor, and you get the idea. Bass continues, therefore, we have numerous angels and gods and goddesses who are said to possess the keys to these gates in various ancient religions. Another predominant figure in the ancient Greco-Roman world who is said in multiple places to have the keys of the underworld is the goddess Hecate, also known as Persephone or Artemis or Diana. In fact, Owen argues that Jesus holding the keys to death and Hades is a polemic directly against the Hellenistic conceptions of the goddess Hecate. Hecate was the primary figure in the ancient Greco-Roman world to be associated with having the keys to Hades. Hecate is also known as Artemis in magic papyri texts, where she's referred to, get this, quote, mother of all things, for you frequent Olympus, and the broad and boundless chasm you traverse. Beginning and end are you. Does that sound familiar? I'm the beginning, and I'm the end. Beginning and end are you, and you alone rule all. For all things are from you, and in you do all things, eternal one, come to their end. And you hold in your hands a golden scepter. So there's lordship and authority. She's given multiple titles here that are exclusively used for God and Christ in Revelation. Hecate is the beginning and the end. Compare Revelation 21:6, 22:13. She alone rules all and holds a golden scepter. Check Revelation 4:11, for that imagery. Now, Bass, again, there's just a lot of material. He goes and he talks about, Egyptian stuff and Anubis, other Greco-Roman deities. When he moves to Second Temple material, there's an interesting couple of sentences here. He says, when we move into the Jewish literature before and after the time of the New Testament, angels are predominantly said to possess the keys. Among these angels are Metatron, Yaoel, Eremiel or Uriel, and the archangel Michael. They are all said to possess the keys to either the underworld or the kingdom of heaven. Instead of having the keys to the levels of heaven, other angels are said to have the keys to Hades. Now, that's the end of the quote. For me, the most interesting one there is Yaoel, which is Yahoel. And if you've ever heard me lecture on the two powers in heaven in Jewish literature, you know that name. Okay, Metatron is another. They're the most interesting because Yahoel was the second power to a number of Jews. So if you're thinking that, you got two powers thinking, you got binitarian thinking, binitarian Jewish monotheism. But for the New Testament and John, who really holds the keys? It's Jesus. I mean, it figures right into this flow, this trajectory of thought. Now, Eremiel is interesting, though, and I'm going to read a little bit about him, what Bass says about his imagery, this other angel. He says, the apocalypse of Zephaniah has striking parallels with the first vision of Revelation. Zephaniah says, then I arose and stood, and I saw a great angel standing before me with the face shining like the rays of the sun in its glory, since his face is like that which is perfected in its glory. And he was girded as if a golden girdle were upon his breast. His feet were like bronze, which is melted in a fire. And when I saw him, I rejoiced, for I thought that the Lord Almighty had come to visit me. I fell upon my face, and I worshipped him. He said to me, take heed, don't worship me. I am not the Lord Almighty, but I am the great angel Eremiel, who is over the abyss and Hades, the one in which all the souls are imprisoned from the end of the flood, which came upon the earth until this day. It's the end of the quote. Now, clearly, Eremiel has replaced Christ in this vision. Bass notes that Christ has replaced Eremiel if Revelation was written after the apocalypse of Zephaniah, or they're both using a common source, if it's before. Either way, Christ is presented as deity in Revelation because he accepts worship from John. Did you catch that difference? See, everything that I just read to you sounds really like Revelation 1, except for one detail. Okay, Jesus doesn't say, "Oh, don't worship me." I mean, it's just really clever. Again, if you are a literate Jew and you're familiar with the apocalypse of Zephaniah and the keys stuff and all the stuff we've been talking about to this point, and you get to Revelation 1 and you're familiar with this apocalypse passage, it's just like this other guy wrote, except for one thing. Jesus does not refuse to be worshipped. In fact, he's equated with, the imagery of him is aligned with the Ancient of Days. We've already talked about this. He is the one who has the keys of death and Hades. Okay, and he's God. Okay, I mean, how many ways can John say it? How many ways can John take a familiar idea to his readers? Again, because he has to describe what the angel has shown him, whether it's a vision or something the angel shows him, or both. It's like 6 of one and a half a dozen of another. And it's strategic. Okay, I'm sure when John's having the vision, the angel doesn't say, "Now, when you go back down, when you get, in your right mind here's a great passage to look up, to help you out." No, I mean, he's showing him things, but John is familiar enough with the material, and he, how do I get the point across? How do I, describe what I've seen? Oh yeah, there's that Apocalypse of Zephaniah thing. That's really useful, or Daniel 7, or whatever. So he's going to use something, whether it's Old Testament or some other text that his readers know, to illustrate what this was like, what he was actually seeing. But he's going to tweak it too. He's going to make sure the theology of the deity of Jesus doesn't get lost. And even that he's going to show is consistent with Jewish two powers in heaven thinking. The risen Christ is the second power. Not some angel, whether it's a biblical angel or Second Temple Jewish literature angel. It's not these. It's none of these. It's him. Okay? It is the risen Christ who is the second power, and now he's the holder of the keys because of the resurrection. Again, all of this is happening in the book of Revelation. So, you get to this, and well, how does this inform our reading of Revelation 1:18? 4 observations. It's absolutely clear that we have a risen Christ in view. Revelation 1:18. Fear not, I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. And I have the keys of death and Hades. So absolutely clear we have a risen Christ in view. Number 2, it's also clear there's a sequence implied. I died. I'm now alive again forevermore. And I have the keys of death and Hades. 1, 2, 3. This follows that. Now, third, and this is important, this suggests, both the risen Christ and the sequence that's implied suggests that before Jesus rose from the dead, he didn't have the keys to death and Hades. Somebody else did. And what these sources, especially Bass, are going to argue is that Jesus descended into the underworld at death. I died. He was there 3 days, during which time he did certain things. We've talked about this before, unseen realm. We talk about 1 Peter 3 with this, the descent into Sheol, into the underworld. So he's there 3 days, during which time he did certain things, one of which being that he conquered death and Hades, personified as supernatural enemies. And he took the keys from their domain, from their hands, as it were, rising from the dead. Now, after he rises, now he is Lord of the living and the dead. He holds the power of life and death. Something Revelation will make quite clear in judgment scenes later in the book that involve the second death. So consequently, what Revelation 1:18 is describing is Christ's descent into the underworld, his combat with and victory over death and Hades. This would have been crystal clear to ancient, again, literate readers. And the history of the church in this regard is telling. Here's the fourth point. Bass points out in detail that the idea that Christ descended into the underworld, descended into hell is the more familiar language through something like the Apostles' Creed, that this idea was a belief embraced by the confessing church across the world until the late 1400s, early 1500s. Everybody believed this. Everybody got it. And if you were an ancient reader, you know, again, the supernatural outlook of all this in terms of the spiritual warfare and the conquering supernatural agents and again taking the keys from them, you know what it means. But we may have lost the detail in the history of the church, but we didn't lose the point, at least up until just right before the Reformation. Now, I think one of the reasons that it is so it's so obvious. I mean, when you see it, when you hear, when you talk about it, when you think about it, and especially if you know the backgrounding of the Old Testament, Second Temple, Greco, I mean, this is just obvious. That doesn't mean that Jesus went to hell, as in he gets a cell where he's going to be punished. See, that's the obstacle for a lot of readers today. He died. He goes to the place where the dead go, the underworld. We have to think of that place in that way. Again, what could be more obvious? But he doesn't remain there. He descended to hell, descended to the underworld is the better way to think about it, to the realm where the dead go. Well, duh, if he died, where else would he go? Yeah, exactly. It's quite obvious. And again, everybody was locked in until, the late 1400s, okay? So this adds weight to, what I'm articulating in Unseen Realm on 1 Peter 3, where there I talk about how Enoch was a type of Christ in his descent. So not only does Christ preach to the imprisoned watcher spirits, reiterating their doom, but he also takes the lunch money from death and Hades. Okay, he's got stuff to do when he goes down to the underworld. First, I got to tell the watchers you ain't getting out, or you might have think you've won after all this time, and your buddy's somewhere, some other evil spirit's going to let you out of here. Well, I got news for you. Yeah, you might be surprised to see me here, but I ain't going to be here long. You still lose, okay? And okay, mission accomplished here. My work here is done. Now I'm going to go over to the gatekeepers, to death and Hades, and I'm going to take the keys from them and sayonara. I mean, I'm out of here. He does certain things, and again, the early church, you could, Bass does a really nice job of showing this. They're locked into this. This wouldn't be news to them. But in our day and age, we've had a history of, this or that tradition or denomination, maybe even some that have removed the line from the Apostles' Creed or fiddled with the language or taught against it or something like that. They just missed the point. They just like with 1 Peter 3, they in some way kind of eviscerate the passage of its intended meaning. When Christ takes the keys, he takes control of everlasting life or death through his resurrection victory. What could be more obvious? Only he from that point forward has the authority over the living and the dead in the form of everlasting life and death. Again, what could be more obvious? Now we have to ask here, we've got to transition to Revelation 3:7. How does this inform Revelation 3:7, the keys of David? There is, first of all, there is an intended parallel literarily in the way John writes this. If you compare the flow of Revelation 1, the elements of what's described there, with the flow of Revelation 2 and 3, this comes out. For instance, if you're thinking about Revelation 1, 17 and 18, just think about the sequence here, or the sequence of the elements. I am the first and the last, even the living one, and I was dead, but behold, I now live forever and ever. I have the keys to death and Hades. If you go over to chapter 2, in verse 8, you read, thus says the first and the last. That's a parallel to Revelation 1:17. Continuing with 2:8, the one who died but came to life. There's a parallel with 1:18. If you go to chapter 3, you get this, verse 7, thus says the Holy One, the true one, the one who has the key of David. See, that you would expect keys of death and Hades because they're parallel, but it changes. The wording slightly changes in 3:7. I'm the one who has the key of David, who opens so that no one can shut and shuts so that no one can open. Okay. So the parallel was intended to be noticed, the sequence. Now, Beale and Carson write this. keys in 118b are keys of death and Hades. In 370, a quotation via 22:22 is substituted for the phrase of death and Hades. So now we have the one having the keys of David, who opens and no one shuts, and who shuts and no one opens. Okay, Isaiah 22:22. I mean, it's pretty obscure. Let's go to Isaiah 22, and I'm going to read verses. Let's start down in verse 15. And this is sort of a really obscure passage with an obscure person in it. But I'm going to read Isaiah 22:15 through 25. It says, "Thus says the Lord God of hosts, come, go to this steward, to Shebna, who is over the household, and say to him, what have you to do here, and whom have you here, that you have cut out here a tomb for yourself, you who cut out a tomb on the height and carve a dwelling for yourself in the rock? Behold, the Lord will hurl you away violently, O you strong man." God is angry with this particular steward, okay? "He will seize firm hold on you," verse 18, "and whirl you around and round and throw you like a ball into a wide land." Look, it's almost like a Bugs Bunny cartoon, okay? "There you shall die, and there shall be your glorious chariots, you shame of your master's house." Gosh, that's brutal. Verse 19, "I will thrust you from your office, and you will be pulled down from your station." How would you like that on your job review? You're a shame of your master's house. Verse 20, "In that day," God says, when I punish this guy, in that day, "I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with your robe, and will bind your sash on him, and will commit your authority to his hand. And he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open, and none shall shut, and he shall shut, and none shall open." Okay, there you get the part that John, repurposes in Revelation 3. So Isaiah 20:22 has God getting rid of this one servant that's just the shame of your master's house, and replacing him with Eliakim. And he says part of what he's going to do for this guy is, I'm going to give him the key of the house of David. So this guy's going to be like over the Davidic dynasty where they live. This guy's like over the house, okay? This is a big deal because it's the king, okay? "He shall open and none shall shut. He shall shut and none shall open." Now, going back here to Revelation 3, like what in the world is John angling for, and how does this relate to the keys of death and Sheol, death and Hades? Let's think about what we just read. Eliakim. Probably, none of you named your kids Eliakim, but it's a name formed from El, which is God, and the verb kum, which is to raise up or rise up. Oh, now it's getting interesting. See, his name means El, or God will raise up. Boy, that's interesting in a passage that just referred to Jesus, kind of interesting. John saw significance in Isaiah 22:15-25 because of the name and because of how Eliakim was described. So Beale and Carson write this. They say the substitution, key of David, for the keys of death and Hades is meant to amplify the idea of the original phrase in 118b by underscoring the sovereignty that Christ holds over the sphere of death and Hades. Isaiah 22 describes Eliakim's absolute control over the kingdom of Israel, though eventually he is deposed from his office. I mean, Eliakim doesn't work out as well as God had wanted to. The reference, Beale and Carson continue, to Eliakim as my servant, did you catch that? My servant in Isaiah 22:20, would have been easily associated with Isaiah's servant prophecies of chapters 40 through 53, since the phrase occurs there 13 times. The same phrase occurs only twice elsewhere in Isaiah in reference to the prophet himself in chapter 20, verse 3, and to David himself in Isaiah 37:35. The description of placing the key of the house of David, i.e., which equals the administrative responsibility for the kingdom of Judah, on Eliakim's shoulder, and the allusion to him as a father, did you catch that? To those who are in Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And the reference to him as, again, catch the phrase, becoming a throne of glory. This is Isaiah 22. Those phrases would have facilitated such a typologically prophetic understanding of Isaiah 22:22, since this language is so strikingly parallel to that of the prophecy of the future Israelite ruler of Isaiah 9:6 and 7. The Messiah prophecy, the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name will be called Eternal Father, who sits on the throne of David. Thus, Eliakim's temporary control of the kingdom, historically, as prime minister to the king of Israel, was a prophetic historical pattern pointing forward to Jesus Christ's greater and eternal sovereignty over a greater kingdom. The kingdom, of course, this is me now, this is the end of Beale and Carson. The kingdom, of course, is what? How is the kingdom, how does that work out in the book of Revelation for John? What's the kingdom? It's the new Eden. And how does this relate to having the keys of death and Hades? Because in the new kingdom, the kingdom coming, the new Eden, there is no more death. Hence, the key of David and the keys of death and Hades point to the same thing. Jesus is Lord of everlasting life and death. He alone has the authority to decide who goes where. Are you going to be in the new Eden? Are you going to be in the kingdom? Are you going to be in my house or not? So it's Jesus who offers and secured eternal life by defeating death. Everlasting death can only be experienced by rejecting that offer and the love of the key holder. These passages actually are speaking the same language. They're describing the same, not only destiny, that you're not going to die anymore. There is no more death. The key holder, is going to deal with in terms of finality with both, death. Just go to the end of the book of Revelation. Death itself is destroyed. The key holder is going to deal with death, and he's going to grant everlasting life to those who are aligned with him. It's the key imagery. It's sovereignty. It's eternal life. And that's why we get the David language is just another way of expressing this idea. Again, this is just fantastic stuff. That again, I think this will be one of those episodes where you look back and you go, boy, there was just a lot planted in some simple phrases where, again, if you know the wider context, how death and hell, the underworld are perceived, as demonic figures, and you have the descent idea because you have a sequence here. I was dead, I died, now I'm alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. There's the sequence here. Well, if there's a sequence here, then during the time he was down there, again, he took the keys away, which denotes kingship and authority, and he's the Lord of the living and the dead, and he gets to decide who goes where. And all this stuff is packed in to these phrases. And again, if you can grasp that wider context, this is again one of these other examples of Christ doing spiritual warfare, announcing the defeat, of the keepers while he's down there. Just again, I'll go back to the phrase, taking their lunch money. He's smacking them around. They no longer have authority because of the resurrection. So it's just a fantastic set of images that we find that emerge really, from a few simple phrases in these verses.